For 200 years, the question hung in the air like dust over the Valley of the Kings. Who were the ancient Egyptians, really? Black? Something in between? Something else entirely? Museums whispered one answer. Textbooks printed another. Politicians made it about themselves. And the mummies just lay there, silent, holding the only honest reply inside their bones. Then in 2017, a team of geneticists did something nobody had managed to do before. They cracked the DNA of ancient Egyptians who lived 3,000 years ago. They compared it to every major African population alive today. And when the results came back, the room went quiet, because the match wasn't where anyone expected it to be. Let me walk you through this, because the story is wilder than any documentary you've ever seen on it. The site is called Abusir el Malek. It sits in Middle Egypt on the west bank of the Nile, about 100 kilometers south of Cairo. For more than 1,000 years, this place was a cemetery. People were buried there from the late New Kingdom all the way through the Roman period. That's a span covering the rule of pharaohs, the conquest of Alexander, the kingdom of the Ptolemies, and finally the Roman emperors. 1,000 years of layered history packed into one strip of desert. And inside that desert, more than 150 mummies, preserved by the dry air, waiting. For decades, scientists believed it was impossible to extract usable DNA from Egyptian mummies. The heat alone, they said, would destroy it. The chemicals used in embalming, the natron, the resins, the bandages soaked in linen oils, all of that should have shredded the genetic material long ago. Every previous attempt had ended in contamination or noise. Egyptian DNA was the Mount Everest of ancient genetics. Everyone climbed, nobody reached the top. Then a team from the Max Planck Institute in Germany decided to try again, but smarter. They didn't go for the soft tissue. They went for the petrous bone, the densest piece of skull behind the ear, the part that protects DNA better than any other bone in the human body. They took samples from 90 mummies. They worked in clean rooms that looked like NASA labs. They got full mitochondrial genomes from 90 individuals. And for 3 of them, they got the gold standard complete genome-wide data. Real ancient Egyptian DNA, the first ever published. And now comes the part that turned the entire conversation upside down. The researchers ran the genetic data against modern populations. Modern Egyptians, modern Sudanese, modern Ethiopians, modern Nigerians, populations from across sub-Saharan Africa, populations from the Levant, from Anatolia, from Europe. They wanted to see who these ancient Egyptians most closely resembled genetically right now, not in stereotype, not in mythology, in code. The closest match wasn't where anyone had been arguing it would be. The ancient Egyptians from this site, dating from roughly 1400 BC to 400 AD, clustered most closely with ancient populations from the Near East, specifically with Neolithic and Bronze Age people from the Levant, modern-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. They also showed strong genetic ties to Anatolian farmers, the people who once lived in what we now call Turkey. In simpler words, these mummies had more in common genetically with people from the Eastern Mediterranean than with most populations south of the Sahara. But hold on. Before anyone takes that single sentence and runs with it in the wrong direction, you need to hear the rest, because the second finding is just as shocking, maybe more. When the team compared the ancient Egyptian DNA to modern Egyptians, the people living in Egypt today, they found a difference. Modern Egyptians carry roughly 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies did. 8%. That's not a rounding error. That's a tectonic shift in the gene pool. Something happened in the last 1,500 years that pulled Egypt closer, genetically, to the rest of Africa. And the scientists had a pretty good idea what. 3 things working together over centuries. First, the trans-Saharan slave trade, which moved millions of people from sub-Saharan Africa into Egypt and the wider Arab world during the medieval period. Second, increased mobility along the Nile after the rise of Islam, which connected Cairo to Sudan, Sudan to the Horn of Africa, and the Horn to West Africa in ways that pharaonic Egypt had never quite managed. Third, simple river commerce, the kind that doesn't make it into history books. Traders, soldiers, wives, workers, generation after generation, slowly redistributing the genetic map of the Nile Valley. So the Egypt of Cleopatra was not genetically the Egypt of today. Both are Egyptian. Both are real.
But they aren't identical. Now you're starting to see the trap that every prior debate fell into.
People kept asking a yes or no question: were the ancient Egyptians African or not? When the actual answer is, of course they were African. They lived in Africa. They built a civilization on the African continent. The question was never about geography. The question was about ancestry, and ancestry doesn't move in straight lines. It braids. It folds back on itself. It gets reshaped by trade routes and conquests and droughts and marriages that nobody wrote down. But here's the part the headlines almost always miss. The sample from Abusir el-Malek covers a specific window, from about the time of Ramesses II all the way to late Roman Egypt. It does not cover the Old Kingdom. It does not cover the pyramid builders. It does not cover pre-dynastic Egypt before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC. And it does not cover Nubian Egypt, the long centuries when Kushite pharaohs from the south ruled the two lands. For all of that earlier history, and for the population of southern Egypt, which sat closer to Sudan and was clearly more African in genetic character even in pharaonic times, the picture is almost certainly different. This is where a second study, published a few years later, comes in. Researchers looked at modern populations across the Horn of Africa and Egypt, comparing them with genetic markers known to be ancient. They found that southern Egyptians and northern Sudanese carry signatures that link them directly to populations that have lived along the Nile for tens of thousands of years. The Nile, it turns out, is not just a river. It's a genetic highway, and it's been running traffic in both directions since before anyone was building pyramids. Ancient Egypt wasn't a single people. It was a meeting point. A confluence of farmers from the eastern Mediterranean who brought wheat and barley, herders from the Sahara who came east as the desert dried up, Nilotic peoples flowing in from the south, and traders from every coast within reach. So when the geneticists said the mummies from Middle Egypt looked most like Near Eastern populations, they weren't saying ancient Egypt was a colony of Syria. They were saying that in this one cemetery, in this one time period, in this one region of a vast country, the population had a particular signature. Pull samples from Aswan instead of Fayum, and you'd probably get a different answer. Pull samples from a Nubian pharaoh's tomb in the 25th dynasty, and the picture would shift again. Egypt was a layered cake, not a single flavor. Still, the shock for many people came from one specific implication. For more than a century, a particular school of thought had insisted that pharaonic civilization was overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, a sub-Saharan African creation, culturally, biologically, philosophically. Another school had insisted just as loudly that the pharaohs were essentially Mediterranean, basically Proto-European, with no real connection to the Africa to their south. Both of those positions, taken at full strength, just don't survive the DNA. The mummies say something more complicated and, frankly, more human. Ancient Egyptians were Africans whose closest genetic cousins, in the period we sampled, lived in the eastern Mediterranean. Their descendants today carry significant additional African ancestry that arrived after the pharaohs were gone. Their southern neighbors and southern compatriots always had deeper genetic links to the rest of Africa. And the civilization itself, the gods, the writing, the geometry, the engineering, was born in Africa on African soil by people whose ancestors had been crossing in and out of this corner of the continent for 100,000 years. There's a reason this finding hits so hard. We tend to want our ancient civilizations to belong to us, to prove something about us, whoever we are. And every time genetics tells the actual story, the story refuses to belong to any one team in the modern fight.
The mummies don't owe anyone a flag. They were complicated, mixed, regional, changing.
They were, in the deepest sense, exactly what you'd expect a 4,000-year-old civilization at the crossroads of 3 continents to be. And here's what I find genuinely beautiful about the research. The team didn't go in with a thesis to prove. They went in with a hard technical problem. Can we get clean DNA out of these bodies? And when the answer turned out to be yes, the data told its own story. The Petrus bone became a time machine. The mummies started talking again, after thousands of years of silence. And the words they spoke were not the words anyone in the debate had been putting in their mouths. Other research followed. A different team looked at the genetic ties between modern Copts, Egypt's ancient Christian community, and modern Egyptian Muslims, and found that the Copts preserved a slightly older genetic signature, closer to that of the mummies with less of the post-Islamic era African admixture. Not absent, just less. Another team studied King Tutankhamun's family lineage and found patterns consistent with North African and Near Eastern ancestry layered together.
A third group reanalyzed the original Abusir data with newer methods and confirmed the basic conclusion. These mummies were, genetically, a Mediterranean-leaning population embedded inside a continent whose other regions were genetically very different from them and from each other.
The takeaway is not that ancient Egypt belonged to anyone but Egyptians. The takeaway is that Africa is not, has never been, a single people. It is the most genetically diverse continent on Earth, by a wide margin. There is more genetic difference between a person in Ethiopia and a person in Senegal than between a person in Norway and a person in Japan. To ask whether ancient Egyptians were African is, biologically, like asking whether the ocean is wet. To ask which Africans they resembled most is the better question, and the answer is the one the bones gave us. In this cemetery, in this stretch of centuries, in this part of the Nile, the people most resembled their neighbors to the east and northeast. In other places and other times, the answer would be different. That's not a contradiction. That's history.
This rewired anything in your head about Egypt, about Africa, about how identity actually works in deep time. Drop a comment with the single fact that hit you hardest. Hit the like so more people get pulled into this honest version of the story instead of the cartoon one. And subscribe, because the next video digs into the Nubian pharaohs who ruled Egypt for nearly a century and what their DNA reveals about the deeper African roots of the Nile.
The mummies haven't finished talking yet. We've barely started listening.